So thank you, Gary, and everyone for letting me give my presentation. This is something I prepared for our Revive team. For those who aren't familiar with Revive, it goes alongside with the ELCA's different programs they've done over the last couple of years, redevelopment, they had all kinds of different names. They change their names every couple of years. But the newest idea is to train people at these big ELCA things to then come to their individual synods to then present the information. And so I've gone to actually 2 of those big ELCA trainings, and here I am to talk to you about outreach to millennials and Gen Xers. And I just want to give you some background on me and why this is my passion. So I was born in 1985. And if any of you attended the Growing Young conference thing a few weeks ago, 1985 is the year that the speaker said the church functions like we're in 1985. So if you think about that, that means that the church has not changed since 1985, which basically means everything I've experienced in my life has had no impact on the church. And so then where can I and people like me see myself in the church if the last 34 years, haven't seeped into the ethos, seeped into the culture? If what is stopping us from accepting the things that have happened? I mean, I'm an old millennial. And so I remember, the times before cell phones, the times, when phones were still plugged into the wall. I'm not that young. I remember the time before this crazy technology explosion. And yet so much has changed in my lifetime, but the church has not. It's stayed very much to what it was 34 years ago. So another thing I just want to share about me quickly is that on internship, so internship a year long, 6 months in, my treasurer at the church I was interning at says, we only have enough money to survive for 6 more months, and then we have to close our doors. And no one was told this before I accepted the internship. No one knew. They thought I was just going to a normal church. And so my internship, the last 6 months of my internship, I read everything I could on dying churches. I read everything I could on church closures, what causes churches to close. I had conversations with different church leaders about church closure, including Bishop Satterley before he was the bishop. And one of his books has a specific portion that talks about this. And so I became this expert on church closure who wasn't even ordained yet. And so it was funny because when I finished internship, they debated making me go again because I had such an unconventional experience. But I will say I am better prepared than most to be in the church today because of this experience, because I came face to face with the death of the church, and the church did close. My last service was in July, and they closed officially in January and sold their building. So that is a huge part of why I am so passionate about keeping the church alive and getting young people into the church, because I think that is our key to having a future. And when I say young people, as most folks do in church, it usually means the under 50 crowd, where it probably should mean, 20 and 15 to 25 maybe, but young people often means under 50. All right, so the generations. So we have the builders who are 71 and older. We have the baby boomers who are 52 to 70, and that is clearly the majority of our churches are baby boomers. We have Generation X, which is roughly age 37 to 51. Generation Y, which is also called the millennial generation, which is age 22 to 36. You might also see this split up between old millennials and young millennials, or even the young Gen Xers and the old millennials will call themselves the MTV generation. So that's like me, that's the 80s babies who kind of, again, saddle this line between before crazy technology and after crazy technology. And then we have Gen Z, which is age 7 to 21. And We don't know yet the under 7 crowd, Gen Alpha, what they're going to be like. But I'm so excited about Gen Z. That's the next generation that's going to they're going to blow us millennials out of the water. They're going to do amazing things. But today we're going to focus on Gen X and the millennials. All right. Oh, and one thing I do want to point out is if you look at this call and who's on the call, you can see that the majority of people are baby boomers. And there's only a few of us who are younger.
I'll take Gen X. That's, yeah, I'm right in the middle.
Yeah, a couple Gen Xers, a couple millennials. And unless anyone's joined, I can't see everyone anymore, but I believe I'm the only woman on the call. So I am very used to being sticking out like a sore thumb in the church. And that's just, that's just what I've come to know. And I honestly, and I mean this, I don't know if I was not a pastor working to reform things, if I would go to church, only because I very rarely feel like I fit in. And I think that is a theme you'll see with a lot of millennials that you talk to. And people love having friends at church, right? Like, I know my parents, like, all their best friends when I was growing up were from their church. And right now, most churches have like a trickling of millennials and Gen Xers. And so it's hard to find friends there. And not that that's the most important thing, but you want to have people who share your faith, who you can talk to, and not that you can't talk to other generations, but it is nice to talk to people who are like you, who have experienced things like you. And so we have a lot of work to do. And I do want to preface this by saying this does not diminish the work of older generations. There's just a need to focus on the people who aren't in our pews, figure out why, and figure out how we can get them there, because everyone deserves to have access to Jesus and to the altar and to the church. So my book recommendation for you is Reaching People Under 40 While Keeping People Over 60, Being in the Church for All Generations. Now, this book was written in 2008, so it's a little outdated. I believe it's 2008. And it is, the author, I believe, is Assembly of God. So it's a different denomination, different culture, a little outdated, but psychologically, he explores like what makes the different generations tick, what experiences have led them to have like the personality of their generation, and specifically how those experiences relate to how they interact with the church. And so your handouts, you can see I have these pages that say the builders, the boomers, Gen X, and the millennials. And these come directly from this book. And they are just like, it's just a gold mine of information as you're thinking about like, okay, I want to start a new project. How will this reach baby boomers? How will this reach millennials? All of that. It's just amazing information. So I really encourage you to read these sheets and share them with people. Okay. So the facts. I think we know there are a lot of millennials in the church. The majority of my friends are either pastors, or my peers. They're either pastors or they don't go to church. I have very few friends who go to church but are not working in the church. I can think of maybe one or two. So only 28% of millennials attend church. 59% of millennials who grew up in the church have left. 80% of millennials consider themselves spiritual, while 40% consider themselves religious. So I have a cousin my cousin's wife sent me an email, and she said to me, I'm an atheist. I don't like church. I don't trust church. I will never go to church. I've been watching your sermons online every week, and I love them. I want to support you. I want to support what you're doing, even though I don't believe in God and I don't go to church. And I think that is a very common theme among millennials. They don't trust the church. It's not that they're not yearning for something, want the world to be better, want to connect with God in a spiritual way. But there's something about the church that's holding them back. The very first wedding I ever did, it was in Charlottesville, Virginia. And it was, it was mainly, my peers, people my own age, very few religious people. The bride and groom, the bride was a friend from high school, and they were not churchy people. And so I'm like, okay, I'm going to take this as my opportunity to tell a bunch of people who don't know Jesus about Jesus. Which is one thing I love about weddings and funerals, is it's one place where people will hear, even if they don't go to church, they'll hear the gospel. So I just made it the basics about God is love. God is love, God is love, God is love. That was like everything I talked about at this wedding sermon. After the service, I must have had 10 people come up to me that I didn't know and say to me, can I talk to you about why I don't go to church? Everyone had a story. One girl, it was that her mom was a lesbian, and so she didn't trust the church. And one year on Easter, this girl just begged her mom, said, everyone goes to church, can we try it? So of course they tried it, and they got kicked out because her mom was a lesbian. And she said, I could never go back to church because that was too painful as a child, watching my mom be hurt that way. And like everybody had a story. And so one thing I do want to stress is this talk of nuns and duns is not the whole story. The whole story is that people have left for very, very good reasons. And usually when people come to my office to say, or call me or text me or whatever it is to communicate with me about this, one of the first things I say is, I understand completely why you don't trust the church. I'm sorry that happened to you, but I understand completely. Because I think we need to recognize that pain, that there's a lot of pain and there's a lot of rejection that has led to millennials and Gen Xers not being in the church. So to continue with my statistics, at the present rate of change, and this was in 2007, most Americans will be non-Christian by the year 2035. So clearly something has to change if we want to, change the statistics so more people are learning about Jesus and are starting to follow Jesus. And in 2018, only 1 in 7 pastors was under 40, which I think is very significant. You'll see that I try to gather together the millennial pastors in our synod and the young Gen Xers a lot, just to check in, because it is very hard to, again, be the odd man out, so to speak, or the odd woman out, as it usually is in my case. It's a challenge because you're almost constantly having to explain why you think differently and feel differently. So, before someone can be reached for Christ.
Christin,
what?
One quick question. That's
yeah.
7 pastors. Is that ELCA or across any Christian denomination?
I believe that was any denomination.
Okay.
I'd have to look up where I found it, but I believe it was anywhere.
Okay, thank you.
Yep. All right. Before someone can be reached for Christ, the negative image must be overcome. So if you were to ask a random millennial off the street why they don't go to church, my guess would be that they'd say something like the church is sexist, the church is racist, the church isn't welcoming to the LGBTQIA community, the church is a place where people fight and bicker. There are so many negative views, again, from my peers, from people my age, of the church. Now, not all churches are like that, and some are. And so this is why it's something we all need to work on, because say I can convince my cousin's wife with, my sermons or whatever, to try the ELCA congregation in her town. I can say the ELCA, they're not closed-minded like the churches you hear about on the news or what, So she goes, and maybe there's a bunch of people after the service who are fighting over the change in the bulletin board colors, right? So then what I've said is meaningless to her, because she's like, oh, no, she's the exception. Her church is the exception. my bias, my assumptions have now been confirmed. So it's really important that we are all working on this. So millennials want authenticity, mission, and welcome. Very rarely in the church do I feel, even as a pastor, that people really, really want to know what I think. And I think a lot of it is because of my age. Of course, some of it is gender, and some of it is just because our culture is so like, you know, everyone's out for themselves these days. Like, you look at politics and all that, and people don't want to hear other opinions. But even in the ELCA, I feel like my opinion, and I think some of my colleagues feel the same, it doesn't bear that much weight because I'm part of that that generation of the nuns and duns who don't really care about church, who put sports as more important than church. There's so many stereotypes that we could get into, and comments that I'm sure you've heard from people about young people these days, which again often means the under 50 crowd. But we can get into that more. Mission. Everyone I know, like, that's almost everyone I know that's my age, is like on fire about like fighting for racial justice, or, you know, making spaces inclusive for LGBTQIA people and all of that. And if our churches would embrace the current issues of the world, a lot of people, even if they're like, not sure about this Jesus thing, might come to something like I think about, like, we're doing the crop walk, right? Like, that's about feeding hungry people. I know a lot of people who might be willing to walk in the crop walk who maybe wouldn't even want to try church yet, but it's a step. So mission can be a great outreach tool. It's a great way, because if you're doing things that millennials care about, and social justice work is something that millennials care about, then you're going to attract them. Now, again, they might not come to your church like worship service immediately or any of that. But if you can get them to come and just start to explore, meet you, you know, see what you're about, like that is a step in the right direction. I think the number I heard once was you have to have 7 positive interactions with the Christian faith before you'll actually go to a worship service. So think about that. If you're dealing with people who already have a negative image, think the church is meaningless to them, think it's a waste of time, or worse, harmful, they have to have 7 positive interactions before they're going to come to church. That's a lot of work to do. But, you know, part of that is, you know, you never know which touch you are. So, you know, just do what you can, and hopefully others are also doing what they can. And authenticity is absolutely so important. I want to go to a church that practices what they preach. I don't want to hear that we welcome all people, you know, and then see that certain people are treated differently. You know, my latest example would be, I don't want to hear a church say we welcome all people, but we don't want children to be in the sanctuary, right? Because then we don't welcome all people. And I'm just so sick of seeing like all are welcome on church signs, because I'm like, really? Are you really willing to say that and mean it? Because if you don't mean it, that's even worse than like not saying it. So millennials want authenticity. We want to see, if you're gonna preach about the Prince of Peace, we want to see peace. If you're gonna preach about the God of love, we want to see love. Like, and of course, you know, we're humans, we're flawed, but we want to see that you're trying. So, This is my thing, and I feel very strongly about this. Never allow anyone in your church to ever utter the phrase, "Young people these days, fill in the blank." I kind of supported a Bible study at a previous congregation where I didn't run it, but I would go to offer, you know, pastoral insights or whatnot. And at least 3 times every single Sunday, someone made a comment. Young people these days are lazy. Young people these days, you know, don't care about Jesus. Young people these days are bad parents. Young people these days are always on their phone, blah, blah, blah. It's always negative. I think most of us, if someone said like, women these days don't know their place. Like, we would know that that was an inappropriate comment. You know, if someone said, you know, well, Black people these days are, you know, fill in the blank, we would know that's an inappropriate comment. I would say that in our church, in the current situation where millennials are such a minority, saying this phrase, young people a day, has that same effect. It's just continuing negative stereotypes, and it's creating a culture that no young person wants to be in. Now, young people itself, as I mentioned before, is usually the under 50 crowd. That in itself is kind of a weird term, because like, I'm 34, I have a house, I have children, like, I'm not 20. Am I, you know, am I super seasoned? Do I have all the wisdom of many of you? Of course not. But young people makes it seem like I'm not, you know, an established professional person. And so just think about that language that is used around young people, millennials, Gen X, you know, people under 50. Think about the language that's used, and that might be an easy way to start to establish some change without people getting scared too much. It's just the language you use and how you talk about and uplift people from the younger generation. So stop the culture of parent shaming. I cannot tell you how many times people have said to me in my career, like, can you believe so-and-so and what a bad parent she is and blah, blah, blah. Okay, the generations have very, very, very different styles of parenting. That doesn't mean one is bad. That just means they're different. The world is different. Kids are, you know, allowed to do things nowadays that they didn't do before. Parameters around like what was acceptable ways to discipline children was much different. You know, I know like when my dad was a child, he would get, you know, spanked with a belt, and that was very normal when he misbehaved. Well, that doesn't, you know, that's not okay now. And so some of these changes are good and some are just different ways of parenting. But we need to start thinking of things as different. There are different generations who grew up in different ways, not bad, because that's what I hear a lot. Kids are so bad these days. Parents just let their kids run around and do whatever they want. Parents just let their kids on their, right? We need to stop the judgment and the parent shaming. So some positives we can do is value diversity. The more open that we can be in our churches to different cultures, religions, traditions, customs, races, all of that is appealing to millennials. One of the things you'll see on the sheet about millennials that I passed out is they're just very like open and accepting people, like the personality of the millennial generation. It's like all religions are valid, like all of us are like, you know, seeking our own truth together to make the world a better place. I know it sounds kind of like hippy dippy, but there is this sense of like, let's accept each other and let's all find our own truth. And another thing that's important with that is that millennials are very community oriented. And I think this is where a lot of the rub comes in the church, is that, again, the personality of the generations, as the author describes them in the book I mentioned, baby boomers are much more self-focused. And I didn't say selfish, but self-focused. So the church, it's like, what can I get out of church? Or, you know, what did I receive today from the sermon? Whereas millennials, it's more like, okay, like, what can I do to help my neighborhood? And I'm not saying that both generations don't do, you know, both of those things, but the stereotypes of the generations are the value is really, really high on community and communal experience for the millennials, and very little importance of like, what did I get out of it? What, you know, how do I feel when I'm in worship? What do I like? You know, that kind of thing. Whereas for the baby boomers, that is important. And again, I'm not saying that as a negative, but, you know, I think about, you know, the people who say like, I really, you know, I really don't like it when we change the liturgy because this brings me comfort and this brings me joy. And of course, right, that's important, but we just have to start finding this balance because the values are very, very different in a lot of ways. Welcoming people who are LGBTQIA, I think is like so important. I think most millennials have this stereotype that churches hate gay people. And you read comments online on Facebook posts and whatnot, and it is disgusting. It is disgusting the things people say, like believing in Jesus equals like hating LGBTQIA people. And that is absolutely ridiculous. And the sooner we can dispel that horrible, hateful speech, I think the more millennials, honestly, that we will attract to the church. It's so out there, this negativity and this awful, so that is definitely something the church needs to work on. Even a church like ours that is, more accepting, we still have a lot of work to do. And finally, embrace technology. In 1985, there was not Facebook, there was not Twitter, there was not text messaging, there was not cell phones, there was not any of that. But that was 34 years ago. 34 is a long time. I have, gone to school for 10 years, higher education for 10 years in that time. I've had 2 children, bought a house, right? Like 1985 was forever ago. We have to change and embrace the technology of today. And people will fight it. People are going to fight that one tooth and nail. But some things, we're going to have to let go of some things, and we're going to have to upset some people if we want to move forward. And we'll talk more about that. So, number 2, leave your comfort zone. Spend time where millennials and Gen Xers hang out. And guess where they don't hang out? The church. So if you want millennials and Gen Xers in your church, you can't just stay in your church. So that's very important. I know Gary and some others do pub theology. I love pub theology. We did pub theology when I was in Mason, and we started getting people just from the local community to come join us. And they were millennials, and they just would come and join our sessions and talk about Jesus. And it was so cool and inspiring. And stuff like that really works. It really does. Part of my goal as pastor is to, like, if I have teenagers or even, young adults who are participating in community events or whatever, I go to them. One of my parishioners' sons was in a band concert. I went to it. Like, I want to get out there and meet people where they are. So support your pastor. Obviously, you all are pastors, but you can't do this all by yourself. You could go out and get a bunch of millennials to come to your church, but if no one is on board with having them there and having them express their ideas and opinions and viewpoints, which again are going to be different than most of your membership, like, why'd you bring them in the first place, right? It's a setup for disaster. So you have to get everyone on board with this, that this is something intentional that you want to do. You want to reach out to this generation that doesn't know Jesus. Next point is so important. Put adults under 50 in key leadership positions. Prepare them for success and support them publicly. Now, this doesn't mean just be like, oh, if I just put the 3 millennials in my church, as heads of committees, like, problem solved. But we need to prepare them. This is where, when people say, but, Pastor, I feel like you're forgetting the older generations, like you don't care about the older generations. And it's like, no, you have the most important role to do. And that is to pass on the knowledge that you have. That is to take these people under your wings and show them what you're doing, how things are done at a church, teach them so they can take over. At the Growing Young conference, they call this keychain leadership. You don't just hand someone the keys to the car and let them drive. There's driver's training, you drive with them, you practice, there's all kinds of steps. That is what it needs to look like in our churches. We have to hand down the keys. I had a young man at one of the churches, and when I say young, I mean he was like 40, and he came to speak at this event I did, and afterwards he was asking me, how's the church going? And I mentioned that our council president was I think she was 36 at the time. She was 36. And he just stopped dead in his tracks and stared at me. He said, they're allowing people under 50 on council now? I was like, yeah, they are. He's like, wow, if I thought my voice mattered, I might have stayed at your church. And I think that is that is how millennials feel. I mean, I know that's often how I feel. And I think we need to hear these stories. So Yeah, put adults in key leadership positions. For our Revive team, Dave Spring intentionally has put a lot of millennials on this team, you know, kind of empowering us as the future leaders of the church. And I fully believe the church will still be here in 30, 40, 50 years. It's not going to look at all the same as it does now, but I think it will still be here. And I'm personally very excited to be one of the people to help bridge this gap over to the next, whatever the church is going to be next. So building relationships has to be a priority. Again, that's that communal thing. Like, I don't want to go to church and have it just be like me and my family get our fill and then we go home. I'm like, I need a community. I need people supporting people. You know, I need everyone like checking in on each other. Like this very communal, you know, kind of family feel is so, so important. And sincerely, not in a cliquey way, but in like when you're at this church, you're welcomed, you're loved well. Use social media and use it well. Okay. I have a huge pet peeve when people misuse social media, don't understand how to use it, like post things that should have been put in an email, all of that. So my recommendation to pastors, especially ones who are older than me, is to get training on how to do this stuff. Get training on how to use social media and how to use it well. If you're gonna open a Twitter account, figure out how to use Twitter before you do it. Don't just guess as you go. If you're going to use Facebook, learn about things like boosting posts and how to do that and why to do that and what audience to reach and all of that stuff. It's so, so, so important. The majority of people who contact me to talk about their faith who are like non-Christian millennials is through Facebook. So especially with your crowd that's like between like 30 and 50, so those are like your young parents, they're all on Facebook because they're all sharing pictures of their kids. So, okay, here's the pinch. This is again from the book I shared. And let me hear. When you begin trying to make the needed adjustments, church members, usually 60 and over from the church culture and certainly of that value system, regardless of age, become angry, resistant, intolerant of change, withhold their money and leadership, and vote collectively to keep things the way they are. For if the way things are is good enough for me, it should be good enough for others. In most communities, if the congregation decides to keep the over 60 crowd satisfied, the church will not grow numerically, and in time, the congregation will die. In all probability, keeping the 60 plus crowd happy almost always assures that the church will reach few new people under the age of 40. Now, that is not maybe welcome, you know, a welcome thing to hear. And I hear things a lot like, well, our church just, that's not what our church does. Our church is just, we're really good at ministry to older adults. So like, we're not going to focus on millennials. Or I hear like, well, like these people have been members for so long, I don't want to upset them, you know, all of that. But as a millennial, to me, what is being communicated is we don't really care if you're in the church or not. You know, the people who are already here are more important than you. You know, the people who already know Jesus are more important than you. And I'm not saying it's wrong to care about them, to care about their grief, to care about, but we have to also care about the people who aren't there, and the people who have something to offer. And if we want our church to grow into this future church that will be here in 30, 40, 50 years, we have to have faithful people to carry that on. And I don't think we can just like have really big children's programs or something and just pass it on from like grandparents. I think it has to be generationally, you know, the baby boomers to the Gen Xers to the millennials, you know, and to Gen Z down the line. I think we cannot lose an entire 2 generations of people in the church and be sustainable. And so also, I believe for the churches that say, well, we're really good about ministry to older adults, we don't want to focus on millennials, we don't want to do this work, that's fine. But you have to also acknowledge then that your church is going to die, right? You cannot just focus on people over 50 and never reach out to anyone younger, because then once all those people age and die, you have no church. I personally cannot understand why reaching people of all ages is not something every single church is working on, because as I understand it, you know, if our mission is to spread the gospel of Jesus, like we have to keep that going. Like we can't, it's not like special information for one generation. We need to keep that going for every generation for all time, as long as we can. And so I personally believe that this is super, super important work for everyone to be doing. So my final really bold, brash statement is change or you won't reach young people or you die. I mean, that's the simple truth of it. And like I said, I helped close a church on internship. I've seen this play out, and it gets ugly, and it gets very, who matters? Is it the baby boomers? Is it the millennials? Is it like, who matters? And the answer is everyone matters, right? Everyone matters. And we have to start acknowledging that for a long time in our church, the millennials and the Gen Xers have not mattered. And that's how we feel. Like we have not mattered. Our voices have not mattered. Our faith has not mattered. Our desire to make the world a better place has not mattered. And someone has to start communicating to us something different if they want us to be in the pews. All right. So I leave you with some of my fun little memes. I love memes and GIFs and emojis and all those things. So here's one from Tom Rainer. When the preferences of church members become more important than their passion for the gospel, the church is dying. And so again, I think teaching people about Jesus, spreading the gospel, is more important than the color of the bulletin board. And when we don't live into that, when we make making people happy our focus, we're gonna lose out on people finding Jesus. Imagine if this is the late Rachel Held Evans, may she rest in peace. Imagine if every church became a place where everyone is safe, but no one is comfortable. I love that one. It's just so true. Church, we must end our preoccupation with member preferences and the way we've always done it, and instead focus relentlessly on the church's mission and purpose. And the way my screen is, I can't see this one. Let's see. Anyone who has grown mentally, physically, or spiritually knows that growth is not found in comfort. Is it uncomfortable to make the changes to welcome millennials? Yes. Is it uncomfortable to say, hey, we should get a screen? Yes. Are people going to say, if you get a screen, I'm going to leave the church? Absolutely. I've heard that a million times. I'm not a huge fan of screens. I really don't care about screens that much, but to me, a screen would signify this church is open to technology. This church is open to trying something new, right? And these things will be uncomfortable. These conversations will be uncomfortable, but we have to start having these conversations. And through discomfort is where growth comes. So this picture of AOC, this is like one of my favorite memes I've ever seen. And the question was, should we elect more millennials to Congress? And the person's answer was, given my understanding of linear time, I'm fascinated to hear what the alternative is. And I think that this is, yeah, it's great. I think about this with the church, should we let millennials be on council? Should we let millennials run the bazaar? Should we let millennials have a say in what music we sing? Well, what are you gonna do when the older generation is gone if they're not there? This is how time works. I've heard people say, well, the millennials, I don't like their views. I don't want them running the church. Well, then who's gonna do it? People age and die. This is a fact. We have to think about time and how that works, and that we have to pass things on to another generation. We can't just hold on to it. So Shanks Claiborne says, if we lose a generation of young people in the church, it won't be because we didn't entertain them. It will be because we didn't dare them to do something meaningful with the gospel in light of the world we live. I hear all the time, to reach young people, we have to change our music. We have to change our music. We have to change. I love church music. I know there's some millennials on here. I think most of them would probably agree, there is comfort, there is beauty in the church music. Now it is inaccessible, so we need to make music accessible to people who've never heard these kind of churchy hymns, maybe explain to them the history of them, why we sing them, but we don't need to keep focusing on our worship style and our music style, like the things I mentioned earlier, like the authenticity, the mission, that the relationship building, that stuff is so much more important. And like I said, if you're going to attract millennials, it's not going to start inside the church. It's not going to start with the worship service. So the music is something that can come later. It's going to start at things like the crop walk, or like we're doing a voter registration drive this weekend. It's going to start in the pub at Pub Theology. These are the places where you're going to meet these millennials and Gen Xers and be able to invite them in. And only once that relationship is built will they be trusting enough to come to a worship service. And then the rules I live by. Sometimes the best evangelism is simply telling people you're a Christian and then not being a complete jerk.